The first light of dawn crept across the Libyan desert like a thin ribbon of silver, stretching over the sand dunes and turning the horizon into a soft line of gold. At the edge of the field near Benghazi, hundreds of men moved in silence around long rows of aircraft. Their boots crunched over dry earth. Their breath formed pale clouds in the cool morning air. Above them, the sky slowly shifted from deep blue to a faint gray, revealing the unmistakable shape of the machine they depended on, the B-24 Liberator. Its long, thin Davis wings cast wide shadows across the ground, stretching farther than any bomber the Americans had ever flown. They looked like the wings of a giant bird, built not for beauty, but for endurance. Even on the ground, the Liberator seemed eager to rise, as if distance itself was not a barrier, but an invitation. Lieutenant Daniel Mercer stood beneath the massive wing of his B-24, running his hand across the cold metal. The aircraft felt alive, humming faintly with the energy of its crew preparing for the mission. Mechanics checked the engines, feeling for vibrations that should not be there. Gunners loaded belts of .5 caliber ammunition into their turrets. The navigator unfolded maps that stretched from North Africa to the heart of the Balkans. The men all knew the truth. The Liberator was not like the Flying Fortress. It did not fight better. It did not survive damage in the same legendary way, but it could do something no other American bomber could. It could fly farther than anything the United States had ever built. And that made it dangerous. Mercer looked up at the aircraft, still amazed by the size of its wings. The Davis wing design was nothing short of revolutionary. Long, narrow, shockingly efficient. Engineers had discovered that this wing could create lift while using far less fuel than other bombers. That gave the B-24 its defining character: range. Range that allowed it to cross oceans, range that let it reach deep into enemy territory, range that made German commanders stare at maps and wonder, how did they get this far? As the sun rose higher, the airfield came alive with the thunder of engines. The 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines of each Liberator roared to life, sending vibrations through the sand and shaking the loose canvas of nearby tents. The sound was deep, powerful, and unmistakable. Mercer climbed into the cockpit, where the smell of oil and leather mixed with the faint desert dust that always seemed to find its way into the aircraft. He strapped himself into the left seat. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Hartman, settled beside him with a grin that looked more like an attempt to hide nerves. "You ever think about how far this thing can fly?" said Hartman. Mercer nodded slowly. "Farther than any of us should ever go." That was not a joke. When the B-24 came to North Africa, many pilots were shocked by the missions assigned to them. They were handed maps that stretched across entire regions of the Mediterranean. They were given flight plans with distances that seemed almost impossible. And yet commanders spoke of these missions as if they were routine. The B-24 removed the word impossible from their vocabulary. The tower crackled over the radio. "Liberator units, prepare for taxi." Mercer pushed the throttles forward. The B-24 growled as it began to move, shaking the cockpit with a steady rhythm. Dozens of other Liberators followed, their wings glinting in the early light. The runway ahead shimmered with heat, even in the morning coolness. The desert stretched to the horizon, empty and silent, as if holding its breath for what was about to happen. The aircraft lined up one by one. Engines thundered. Dust swirled in thick clouds. Then the first Liberator rolled forward. As Mercer watched it race down the runway, he felt the familiar mixture of fear, excitement, and awe. The aircraft gained speed, rising steadily until the wheels lifted and the bomber climbed into the pale sky like a giant metal arrow. His turn came seconds later. Full power. Wheels studding against the cracked runway. Sand whipping past the cockpit windows. Engines screaming at full throttle. And then the Liberator lifted. Smooth. Powerful. Confident. As if it had never belonged to the ground at all. Below him, the desert shrank into swirling patterns of gold and red. Ahead lay the coastline of North Africa, the glittering Mediterranean, and beyond that, the dark mountains of the Balkans. Mercer stared at the horizon with a feeling he could not fully describe. This was not just another bombing mission. This was the beginning of something larger. The Liberator climbed higher, engines humming in perfect unison. The formation stretched out across the sky, a long line of wings and engines moving northward. From the distance, they looked like migrating creatures crossing continents. German pilots would soon spot them, and when they did, shock would follow. No one believed American bombers could reach this far. Not to Hungary, not to Bulgaria, and certainly not to Romania. But the B-24 could. It was the only bomber in the world with the fuel capacity, the wing design, and the endurance to strike deep into the oil fields Hitler depended on. As the sun rose behind them, Mercer felt the weight of that truth settle on his shoulders. The Liberator was about to reach into the heart of enemy territory, into a place that Germans thought was beyond the hand of American air power, into a target so distant that even the Luftwaffe believed it safe. But the B-24 did not care about safety. It cared about distance. It existed to break the limits of the sky. As the formation climbed higher and the desert vanished behind them, Mercer knew that the Germans were about to learn a lesson they never expected. Nothing was out of reach anymore. The Liberator could fly farther than anyone believed. And now it was coming for the one place Germany thought untouchable. Ploesti, the oil heart of the Reich. Protected, guarded, far beyond the range of ordinary aircraft. But the B-24 was no ordinary aircraft. And on this day, its wings would prove it. The blue of the Mediterranean stretched below the Liberator like a sheet of polished steel, unbroken and endless. Only the thin line of the African coast behind them proved that the crews had not launched themselves into another world. Lieutenant Mercer kept his eyes on the horizon, where the first faint silhouettes of the European continent began to rise from the morning haze. Hours had passed since takeoff, yet the aircraft still felt steady, almost comfortable, as if the long flight were not a burden, but its natural environment. The B-24 Liberator was built for this, built for distance, built for the kind of missions that demanded endurance few pilots had ever experienced before. Hartmann leaned back in his seat, wiping sweat from his brow. "It almost does not feel right," he said. "Flying this far and still having enough fuel to actually fight?" Mercer managed a thin smile. "That is why they gave us this job." The engineer, crouched behind them near the control panel, glanced at the fuel gauges. "We have more than enough," he said, "long as the winds stay calm." Mercer knew what that meant. The Liberator carried enough fuel to cross the Mediterranean, hit a target deep in Europe, and still limp home, even if an engine died. The Davis wing design stretched the range even further, turning every drop of fuel into precious miles. It was the reason this mission was possible at all. Below them, the sea slowly gave way to rugged coastline. Mountains rose like jagged teeth along the shore of Greece. The sun shimmered over the rocky slopes, casting long shadows into narrow valleys. The crews adjusted their oxygen masks as the Liberators climbed higher, preparing to cross the Balkan interior. The intercom crackled. "Navigator here, crossing into enemy radar range. Keep formation tight." The crew members shifted nervously. They all knew the next few hours would decide everything. Up to this point, they had been ghosts gliding over empty sea. But as they approached the European mainland, German listening stations would begin to pick up faint echoes on their screens. The confusion would follow shortly after. The Germans believed that American bombers could not strike this deep into Europe without fighter escorts. They believed the Mediterranean bases were too far from Ploesti. They believed Romania was beyond reach. But the B-24 was rewriting those beliefs with every mile. Mercer looked down at the rugged landscape. There were no friendly airfields here, no emergency strips, no rescue boats. A single engine failure over these mountains meant disaster. Yet the Liberator engines hummed steadily, 4 perfect rhythms beating against the thin, high-altitude air. The radio operator spoke quietly. "Picking up German chatter,
They know someone is out here, but they are not sure how far. Mercer felt a thrill in his chest. Confusion was their ally. Surprise was their shield. German Fighter Command had long studied the range of American bombers. They knew the B-17. They knew its limits. They believed they knew the reach of American air power. But the Liberator changed those calculations. The Luftwaffe was still adjusting to it, still trying to understand how an aircraft that looked so awkward on the ground could become a long-distance predator in the sky. For now, they were guessing, and guessing badly. A voice from the lead aircraft broke through the static. "Approaching Bulgarian airspace. Stay at altitude. Expect fighters." The sky grew darker ahead, as if warning them of what was waiting. Mercer tightened his grip on the control yoke and scanned the horizon. The Balkans were a labyrinth of valleys and ridges, perfect hiding places for enemy fighters to climb and intercept incoming bombers. The first contact was faint. A thin line, a glimmer, a streak of sunlight reflecting off metal. Then two more. Then dozens. German Bf-109s climbing from hidden bases in Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, their engines screaming as they fought to reach the altitude of the Liberators. They climbed steeply, struggling to intercept the formation in time. The German pilots were not afraid of American bombers. They had faced them before, but this situation was different. These bombers were not coming from England. They were not coming from Italy. They were coming from Africa, from a place that the Luftwaffe believed was too far to threaten the oil fields of the Balkans. Mercer could almost feel the shock in the way the enemy fighters scrambled. The Germans were late. They were climbing desperately, struggling to intercept a formation that should not have been here. Not this far inland. Not this deep into the European continent. Not with this much fuel still left to burn. The radio crackled again. "Fighters at 2 o'clock. Mercer watched as a group of Bf-109s angled toward the formation. The tail gunners spotted them first. Streams of tracer fire lit the morning air. The Liberators shook as their machine guns opened fire, brass casings pouring into the wind. The enemy fighters darted in and out of the formation, but their attacks lacked the confident rhythm of experienced interceptions. They were out of position, out of time, caught by surprise. Hartmann leaned forward to look through the window. "They did not expect us," he said. "They never do," Mercer replied. The Luftwaffe fighters fired a few bursts, but soon peeled away, forced to break off their runs because they lacked the altitude or the fuel to pursue the Liberators on equal terms. Mercer watched one Bf-109 climbing steeply, trying to reach them, then stalling, dropping away like a stone. The German pilot corrected, turned, and vanished into the mountains below. The message was clear. The Liberator had reached a place the Germans never prepared to defend. Hours passed. The bombers flew deeper into Europe. The Balkans unrolled beneath them like a jagged kingdom of stone and shadow. The crews grew quiet. The air grew cold. But the aircraft stayed strong, engines humming with endless confidence. Mercer knew what lay ahead. They were heading toward the beating heart of Germany's war machine, toward the oil fields that fed the tanks on the Russian front, the factories in the Reich, the fuel depots that kept the Luftwaffe alive, toward a place the Germans thought untouchable, Ploesti. And with every mile, with every heartbeat of the engines, with every breath of the men aboard, one truth grew more impossible to deny. The B-24 was not just a bomber. It was a long-distance weapon, a machine designed to strike where the enemy felt safest. And soon, the Germans would learn exactly how far the Liberator could fly. The morning sun was high over the Balkans by the time the Liberators reached the final stretch of their long journey. The distant outline of Romania shimmered beneath the haze, a land of fields, low hills, and, most important of all, oil. Not just any oil, but the heart of Hitler's supply line, the massive refinery complex of Ploesti. Lieutenant Mercer looked down at his map, then up at the horizon. Even from this distance, he could see faint plumes of smoke rising from industrial stacks. The sight tightened something in his chest. They were close now. Too close for nerves, too far for comfort. He switched to the intercom. "All stations, get ready. We are entering the approach corridor." The crew responded with clipped voices. The gunners checked their belts. The bombardier tightened his harness. The radio operator secured loose equipment. Everyone knew the weeks of training had led to this moment. Tidal wave. A mission so ambitious, so dangerous, that even seasoned commanders had questioned whether it could succeed. But the B24 Liberator was the only aircraft capable of reaching Ploesti from North Africa. No other bomber had the range. No other machine could fly that far, strike that deep, and return across the mountains and the sea. And today, 177 Liberators were about to prove it. The formation dropped lower. They were no longer flying at high altitude. This mission demanded something different, something insane. Low-level bombing. Flying so low they could see rooftops. So low trees brushed their bomb bay doors. So low that the entire city of Ploesti would be within arm's reach. German radar operators had already detected them, but confusion rippled through the Luftwaffe network. Bombers this far inland usually came from Italy, not Africa, and those from Italy usually approached at altitude, not skimming the earth. The Allied planners had designed it that way. Surprise, speed, shock. The Liberators descended even lower, nearly touching the tops of wheat fields. The engines thundered across the countryside, shaking windows in distant villages. Farmers dropped their tools and stared as hundreds of bombers swept over them like an iron storm. Inside the cockpit, Mercer felt sweat roll down his back. Flying at this altitude was nothing like the calm endurance of long-range cruising. It was a knife edge. One wrong movement and the Liberator would strike the ground and tear itself apart. Hartman gripped the window frame. "It is like threading a needle while holding a bomb," he muttered. Mercer kept his eyes ahead. The refinery complex was growing larger, a cluster of pipes, tanks, smokestacks, and brick towers sprawling across miles of open terrain. Smoke hung over the city like a dark shroud. Even at a distance, the heat rising from the burning fuel was visible. The intercom crackled. "Flak positions dead ahead." Mercer saw them, dozens of anti-aircraft guns camouflaged in fields and hidden among buildings. The Germans had expected an attack at some point. They had built Ploesti into a fortress of fire, but they had not expected low-level bombers coming from the deserts of Africa. Not like this. The first flak bursts erupted in front of the formation. Not high-altitude blossoms of black smoke, but violent eruptions at ground level, sending shards of metal upward into the paths of the incoming bombers. One Liberator in the lead group took a direct hit to the wing. The fuel tank ignited, turning the aircraft into a flaming comet that plunged straight into a field of corn. The radio operator in Mercer's crew winced. God help them. More flak erupted. The sky ahead flashed with fire and smoke. The Liberators pressed forward, engines screaming at full power. They were committed now. There was no turning back. The only path was forward, through the wall of fire. The lead group veered slightly off course. Smoke, dust, and the chaos of low-level flying had obscured the landmarks. A split-second mistake at ground level meant disaster for the entire formation. The second wave, including Mercer's aircraft, had to adjust instantly. The bombardier shouted, "Stay north! Stay north! That is the White Tower!" Mercer corrected course, banking sharply. The wings brushed treetops, scattering leaves in the blast of the propellers. The city of Ploesti opened before them, like a maze of fire. The flak intensified. Machine gun nests on rooftops sprayed the air with bright streams of tracers. German soldiers firing from balconies. Smoke towers rising like volcanic eruptions. The noise was deafening, a mixture of explosions, gunfire, and the relentless roar of engines. Mercer shouted over the chaos. "Bomb bay doors open!" The bombardier flipped the switch. The metal doors beneath the aircraft spread apart, exposing the bombs hanging in their racks. The Liberator felt heavier, more unstable, buffeted by the blasts nearby. Then they were directly over the target. The refinery complex erupted beneath them. Black smoke billowed upward as burning fuel ignited. The heat was so intense it distorted the air, making the ground ripple like waves on a furnace. Flames rose along pipelines. Storage tanks exploded. The entire landscape shook. The bombardier released the bombs. The Liberator lurched upward as the load fell away. A series of thunderous explosions followed. Mercer could feel the blast wave through the cockpit floor. Then came the worst moment. Escape. Leaving Ploesti required climbing through the densest fire of the entire mission. German gunners had recovered from the surprise. They unleashed everything. Flat guns, machine guns, even rifles and pistols fired upward from rooftops. A Liberator ahead of Mercer took a hit to the nose. The cockpit exploded in a burst of flame. The aircraft nosed into the refinery and vanished in a cloud of smoke. Another bomber lost a wing and spiraled into the ground. Hartman shouted, "Keep her steady! Keep her steady!" Mercer kept his hands firm on the controls. The Liberator shook violently as debris and flak struck the fuselage. The right engine coughed smoke, but kept spinning. The tail gunner shouted that the horizontal stabilizer had been hit. Still, the aircraft climbed. Still, the wings held. Still, the Liberator pressed north, leaving the burning city behind them. The crew breathed for the first time in minutes, but no one spoke of relief. They all knew the truth. They had survived the inferno, but the hardest part was still to come. They were more than 1,000 kilometers from home, over enemy territory, damaged, tired, running out of fuel, no escorts, no mercy. This was the longest return flight in the war, and the Liberator, wounded but still alive, turned west. Its job in Ploesti was finished, but its fight for survival had only just begun.
The landscape of Romania fell away behind them in a haze of black smoke and burning fuel as Lieutenant Mercer guided the damaged Liberator northwest, away from the inferno of Ploesti. The aircraft shuddered with every gust of wind. The right engine spat dark trails behind it, vibrating through the cockpit floor with a steady, unsettling rhythm. The smell of burning oil drifted inside. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the men were trying to understand a harsh truth. They were hurt, deeply hurt, and they were still more than 1,000 kilometers from safety. The intercom crackled. "Top turret to cockpit, you should see the tail. It does not look good." Mercer swallowed. "How bad?" There was a pause. "Bad enough that we better not touch anything too hard." Mercer did not need more detail. He could feel the aircraft listing slightly, its tail fighting to stay aligned. The flak around Ploesti had torn into them at point-blank range. He could picture the stabilizer riddled with holes, pieces of metal hanging loose, cables fraying like thin strands of rope. Hartman glanced at the fuel gauges. "We burned more fuel than we should have," he said quietly. "Low-level flying chewed through a lot." Mercer nodded. They all knew what that meant. Reaching North Africa was no longer guaranteed. Even reaching friendly areas of Greece where the Mediterranean islands would be a victory. The radio operator spoke next. "Picking up German transmissions. They are searching for survivors from the refineries, but they also know we are trying to escape." Mercer stared ahead. The horizon seemed endless. Miles of enemy airspace, mountains, coastal guns, patrol fighters, and the always-present risk of fatal mechanical failure. He took a slow breath. "We keep going west. No turning, no altitude change unless it saves us." Behind him, the bombardier laughed softly. "Saves us from what? Everything out there wants us dead." The laugh was humorless, nervous, real. The Liberators flew in scattered groups now. Some had been shot down. Some had fled in other directions. Others limped west in small clusters, trailing smoke, their gunners scanning the skies for incoming fighters.
The mountains approached first, rising like jagged teeth beneath the aircraft. The Liberator struggled to climb. The damaged engine coughed again, sputtering dangerously before settling into a weak but steady beat. Come on, girl. You have already survived hell. Do not give up now. The aircraft crept upward, climbing inch by inch. The mountains grew closer. Shadows stretched across the slopes like fingers trying to claw them down. The engines roared in defiance. The Liberator cleared the ridge by what felt like meters. The crew exhaled as one, but their relief lasted only seconds. Fighters, 6 o'clock high. The tail gunner shouted the warning. Mercer glanced into the mirror mounted near the cockpit. Distant silver specks glinted in the sunlight. German fighters, BF-109s, maybe a few twin-engine BF-110s. Hartman swore under his breath. Guess they don't want to let us leave. Mercer banked slightly, keeping the Liberator stable. They were alone now. No formation, no overlapping fields of fire, just one wounded bomber trying to outrun the hunters. The right-waist gunner opened fire first, his tracers streaming across the sky. One of the German fighters dodged easily, another dove closer. The tail guns roared. Steel casings clattered across the floor. The bomber shook as the guns fired relentlessly. A BF-109 streaked past the left wing, firing bursts that tore through the already damaged stabilizer. The top turret gunner shouted, "We cannot take many more hits like that." Mercer pushed the throttles as far as the engines could handle. The Liberator surged forward slightly, but the damaged engines sputtered under the strain. The other 3 engines carried the weight, their propellers spinning in a frantic rhythm. The fighters closed again. Then something unexpected happened. They pulled away. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. The German fighters were running low on fuel. They had scrambled late. They had taken off from bases farther east, and like all fighters in wartime Europe, they had strict limits. Mercer watched them turn back toward the mountains. He did not celebrate. He knew the threats were not over. Hours passed. The sun dropped lower, casting long shadows across the Balkan landscape. The Liberator crossed into Greek airspace. The terrain shifted from mountains to rolling hills. The coastline finally appeared, a thin, shining line on the horizon. The radio operator spoke next. "We could try for Crete, or maybe Cyprus, Turkey if we can't hold altitude." Mercer considered it. Turkey was neutral, and many damaged bombers had gone there. But their aircraft was still flying. Barely, but flying. "We go west. As long as we have fuel, we keep moving." They passed over the Aegean Sea. Small islands dotted the water below. The bomber descended slightly as the wounded engine lost more power. The engineer checked the gauges again. "We have about 30 minutes of fuel in number 3. Maybe 40. After that, she's dead weight." Mercer nodded. "Prepare to feather it if we have to." The sky turned orange. The sea reflected the fire of the setting sun. The Liberator flew lower now, skimming the tops of fading daylight. A sudden jolt shook the aircraft. "We lost pressure in the fuel line." The engineer scrambled to reroute the flow, but his voice carried the truth. "We are leaking. Bad. We won't make Benghazi." Mercer studied the chart, calculated silently, looked again at the remaining fuel. "We aim for the nearest Allied-held island, Corfu." Hartman frowned. "We might not reach it." Mercer kept his voice steady. "We don't have another choice." The bomber limped forward, bleeding fuel, bleeding speed, losing altitude inch by inch. The coastline appeared again in the twilight, faint but real. "Come on, girl, just a little more." The radio operator saw it first. "Land, dead ahead." The runway on Corfu was crude, short, barely enough for a healthy Liberator. Mercer leveled the aircraft, dropping the gear. Warning lights flashed. Gear 2 not locked. No time. He lowered the flaps. The Liberator shook violently. Alarms buzzed. The wounded engine sputtered one last time, then died with a low groan. The bomber dropped, slammed into the runway, bounced once, then slid hard across the dirt. Sparks flew, metal screeched. The aircraft skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust. Silence, then breathing, then laughter. Weak, exhausted, disbelieving. They had made it. Mercer unclipped his harness, hands shaking. We flew to hell and somehow came back. Outside, the Liberator sat smoking on the ground, one wing bent, the tail shredded, its engines hissing steam. She had carried them across the sea, over mountains, through fire, through fighters, through fuel leaks. She had no right to survive. But she did. Because the Liberator was not just a bomber. It was a long-distance survivor. A machine designed to do the impossible. Tomorrow the Germans would ask the same question they always asked. How far can the Liberator fly? And tomorrow the answer would be the same. Farther than anyone believes.
The sun was setting over Corfu when the last of the surviving Liberators limped into view, each one a battered silhouette against the orange glow of the horizon. Lieutenant Mercer stood on the dusty strip beside the wrecked remains of his own aircraft, watching the sky as if the next bomber might fall apart before reaching the coastline. Rescue crews rushed across the field whenever a new shape appeared above the trees. Most of the aircraft that returned were damaged, some barely held together. A few crashed short of the runway. But they had come back, from Africa to Romania and then all the way home again. That distance alone was something German pilots had not believed possible. But the B-24 Liberator did not care what anyone believed. It cared only about the next horizon, and it had crossed more of them than any bomber in the war. Mercer wiped dust from his eyes as another B-24 approached. Its left wheel refused to lock. The pilot held the aircraft up with one wing until the last possible moment. When it finally touched down, the Liberator skidded and spun, kicking up clouds of dirt until it came to a trembling stop. Ground crews sprinted toward it. Hartman stood beside Mercer, arms crossed tightly. "How many do you think are still out there?" he asked quietly. Mercer did not answer. Some Liberators had turned toward Turkey, some toward Crete, others had ditched in the sea. The mission had scattered them across half the Mediterranean. But each mile flown proved the same point. No target was too far, no enemy too distant, no border too deep, because the B-24 Liberator lived in the space between the impossible and the achieved. As night settled across the field, the crews huddled around lanterns, bandaging wounds, cleaning weapons, and retelling the events of the day. But their voices always circled back to the same feeling: awe. The navigator from another crew shook his head slowly as he stared at the stars. "We flew from Africa to Romania and back," he said. "That is like crossing a continent twice and still having something left in the tanks." A waist gunner lifted a canteen, hand trembling. Nobody in the Luftwaffe saw that coming. Mercer listened quietly. He could still picture the German fighters scrambling late, struggling to intercept bombers that should not have been anywhere near their airspace. The look of surprise on their faces had almost been visible through the canopy glass. German intelligence had measured the range of American bombers using old data. They assumed the Americans relied on B-17s. They assumed long-range raids were impossible. They assumed Ploesti was safe behind distance itself. But assumptions meant nothing in war. Distance was only a wall until the Liberator broke through it. Mercer thought back to the long, thin Davis wings that gave the B-24 its impossible reach. Engineers once called them strange, fragile, too flexible. Pilots joked that they looked like they belonged on a glider. But the moment those wings sliced through the air at high altitude, they made the impossible possible. The engineer from Mercer's crew sat down beside him, rubbing sore shoulders. "Most planes are built to fight," he said. "The Liberator was built to go where nobody else could. And that made it a weapon all its own. The Liberator had not been designed for glory. It did not have the graceful lines of the fortress. It did not survive damage as dramatically. It did not inspire the same mythology of coming home in pieces, but it commanded a different kind of respect. The respect reserved for endurance, for reach, for range. It was the bomber that turned maps into targets, the plane that made commanders look at the farthest corner of a continent and say, "Yes, we can hit that." The crews around the field began sharing stories of long-range missions in other theaters, the Liberators hunting U-boats across the Atlantic, flying patrols so long that the sun rose and set before they returned, the Liberators dropping supplies into Burma, threading through monsoon clouds and mountain passes, the Liberators flying the long, brutal haul from northern Australia toward the Japanese strongholds of the Pacific. Every story carried the same theme. The B-24 did not stop, did not tire, did not turn back. It pushed farther than anyone thought a bomber could go. Hartman sat down beside Mercer and looked at the dark outline of their wrecked aircraft. Holes peppered the fuselage. One propeller was bent. The tail sat at an angle that made the bomber look like a wounded bird. But even wounded, it had flown hundreds of miles. Hartman spoke softly. "We got hit, burned, chased, lost an engine, lost fuel, lost altitude, but we did not lose the plane." Mercer nodded. "She carried us home." That was the heart of the Liberator's legend. It was not just the distance it could fly, but the determination with which it did it. 1,000 kilometers of danger did not frighten it. Oceans did not intimidate it. Mountains did not slow it. Even enemy fighters, late and confused, could not stop it from reaching places the Axis considered untouchable. An older crew chief approached, wiping grease from his hands. "You boys know what the Germans call planes like this?" Mercer shook his head. He smiled. "The ghosts of the long sky." Hartman frowned. "Why that name?" "Because," the crew chief said, leaning in, "they show up where no plane should be, and then they disappear before anyone can understand how they got there." Mercer looked up at the stars again, feeling the weight of those words. The Liberator had made Ploesti vulnerable. It had shown the Germans that distance was no protection. It had stretched the battlefield across continents, turning geography into a trap instead of a shield. The missions would continue. The distances would grow. The Liberators would roam from Africa to Europe, from England to the Atlantic, from Australia to the deep Pacific. And every time they appeared over a new horizon, German pilots would ask the same question: how did they reach us? The answer was simple. The B-24 did not respect borders. It did not respect distance. It did not respect the limits of maps. It only respected the horizon. And each horizon led to another. As Mercer stood in the dim glow of the lantern light, listening to the distant sound of another B-24 engine sputtering on its final approach, he understood the lasting truth of the aircraft that he had flown through fire and across an entire continent. The Liberator did not just break records, it broke distance itself. And that is why, long after the war ended, long after the last mission was flown, the legend of the B-24 endured. Because it was the bomber that proved one thing beyond doubt: there was no place too far when the Liberator was coming.